In this video, which is probably 10 years too late to be a warning, I will do a recapitulation on exactly what is going wrong with Sweden and what we can think about in terms of Sweden as a case, the reaction to its immigration problem, and maybe a speculation on the next 20-30 years. I think it's worth remembering at least that what has happened in Sweden is a presage to mostly the rest of the first world, in that Sweden was aggressive in their openness and their charity, which will come obviously at a huge cost to the native populace, to the degree that I think it's nigh on unsalvageable in many areas, which is not to say that Swedes are goners and there's no hope. It's not a way of giving you that Debbie Downer attitude. It's more to say that in general there are some irrevocable changes that have happened to Sweden that cannot be exorcised. Now, to do a proper exorcism would be possible, but as we have seen, the appetite for such things is still so low because of the feminization of governance over the last 150 years, and particularly with the catalyst of World War II and what we can now think of as a blacklisting of certain methods of social change. So under that framework, we can at least take for granted some things will never change, and that some Swedes will be Swedes forever, regardless if they're actually Swedes. And deep down, I think everyone knows this. It's intuitive. When you meet someone and you can see that they're not Swedish, I think it's fairly simple to know that skin color is but one element, and that passports are basically, I would say, the most unimportant element to your blood and nationhood, and that something that was invented 100 years ago to cross borders, or 200 years ago to cross borders, is not necessarily representative of anything other than your ability to cross borders. So on that note, we can start, I think, by having a look at immigration to Sweden in general. You have fairly good chronology here of different immigration fluxes, and net immigration is this blue line, which has been fairly steadily, you would say, close to zero, and then emigration, so those leaving Sweden, has been rather lumpy, heteroscedastic data here from 1850 onwards, due to the changes in situation for those who lived in Sweden, particularly rural Swedes, remembering that the urbanization of Sweden happened rather recently, mostly since the 50s, and that Sweden, all Scandinavian countries in particular, basically have been large rural agricultural economies and agrarian societies. So the concentration of people in Göteborg, Stockholm and Malmo is rather recent. So remembering that, we can see huge outflux of people across 150 years from 1850 to 1900, whereby you would say most have gone to more prosperous countries, which at those differing parts in time would have been places like America and Canada. The circumstances around World War II, Sweden being a neutral country ostensibly, meant that they were unaffected in birth rate and death rate, more or less, to that degree. So the changes post 1960 have been completely policy induced, which is to say that the successive Swedish governments have made it an accord that certain lines of policy directed towards more immigrants from certain countries and areas in the world was a priority and or was approved. Let me just zoom in a tad for you here. So looking at recent immigration, you can obviously see a ridiculously high level. That was 2016 or 15, when there was a large influx of refugees from basically the whole third world trying to get to Sweden, because obviously it had quite a high social safety net, which included very generous remittances and payments towards foreigners who basically just had to sign up for the system and wait an outcome on a refugee case, which could take anything from, say, a few months to years. Knowing that was the case, obviously it incentivizes many refugees to cross borders, and particularly going through Germany and Denmark to Sweden, which is obviously hilarious for several, well, ironic at least, if not hilarious, for several reasons. And Sweden participating in none of these wars, so it's very strange to have to, in any meaningful way I should say, and then it's strange to have to understand why they've been chosen as location other than Swedish generosity. So as that as a preface to say, everyone knows that Sweden has had a large intake of immigrants from the third world. I think this is very common knowledge. I'm not breaking any new boundaries with this information to you. So I think contextualizing that, we then dig a little bit deeper into saying, how's it going? And I think media portrays the Swedish cases rather negatively, and rightly so. If we look at just some simple data here on the foreign-born and you say native-born, but the population more or less, and who has been employed, and you can see that the utrikesfödda men, but the foreign-born men are less than basically 50% employed, and you have to remember that the most of the immigrants, particularly in the primary cases, were men from Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, Afghanistan, Eritrea, like really terrible third world countries. So usually between 18 and 45, so prime working age for what would be a soldier in many cases in an army, prime fighting age you might say. And then the women who were correspondingly brought along are usually either relatives or wives, and so having a probably large misbalance in terms of sex gender here allows us to understand that this is even worse probably than it looks, and that if you consider foreign-born to include all, I would say, good immigrants, which includes cases like Danish people living in Copenhagen and working in Malmo or something like that, or living in Malmo, and you have Finns and Norwegians who also live in Sweden and probably only for employment. So pushing this number up, we could, I'd say comfortably say, it's very hard to get the data. That's why I'm having to extrapolate here, but usually between 20 and 30% employment in a meaningful sense. There's some data around what counts as employment, and typically it's such a low level that it's rather droll, in that I think the minimum was like 5,000 krona per month, which equates to maybe like $400-500 euro, sorry. So 500 euro is the basic requirement to be counted as employed, and so if you can't even qualify for that in a country like Sweden, then Sweden has not really got what you need in terms of a better life, other than them giving you money as handouts. So having a large population of foreign-born men being unemployed and dawdling and milling about and not engaged in any prosperous economic activity allows for a large increase in crime, usually crime related to economic and or sexual crime. And so when we do take the corresponding look at the per 1,000 population, you can see here that sex crimes in general have skyrocketed, and you would consider Sweden to have been probably the leading country in equality between men and women, thus corresponding to a lower degree of sexual assault felt by, and what is mostly, women. Sex crimes are disproportionate to women, more or less like 90%, 95%, with a small homosexual contingent, and then the rest a negligible amount towards straight men or something. But more or less it's women who have to bear the brunt of this sex crimes, which is rather strange when you consider their voting patterns tend toward being more open-bordered, even though the conditions for open borders in Sweden allow for more, what you would say is gross violations of the female autonomy. Rape as well, obviously corresponding to the sex crime graph here, in a rather increasing and distressing level. Then manslaughter, which looks quite flat, but it is actually on the rise, and the only reason it looks quite flat is because this graph is not scaled. If it was in log scale, it'd probably be easier to discern. And robbery being quite high and relatively flat, meaning that there is not a dissuasion of robberies necessarily from improvement in conditions. The murder and manslaughter looks like a pretty distressing graph. Additionally, with the totals actually reflecting quite a surprising amount of women committing what you would call murder and manslaughter here, and Sweden in general having quite a high level of growth there. This is indexed to 100, so you can see here there's a 20% increase of murders in general since 2002, which is not the direction you would consider a first world country usually takes. People like to lambast America, but I think if you adjust, and I've done this in previous video, adjust for the white European population of America versus Sweden, it's actually got lower murder and manslaughter charges than Sweden in general. So, and I'm sure if you adjusted for the white native Swedish born, that this level would probably also be a paltry number, much lower, 20, 40, something like that. To know that more crime is being committed is to understand that prison populations would reflect this, and we can see that occurring. I would say that without better data, there's a lot of unreported crime. In some instances there can be up to 90% unreported crime happening in some major metropolitans in Europe, particularly thinking around pickpocketing, robberies, assaults, threats. These typically go unreported to large scales, sometimes 3-4 to 1 and up to 90% unreported. How would you know it's unreported is a typical survey function of have you experienced X in the last year, and then from that you can just at least cross-correlate whether or not there's been the increase in reported actual police investigations, and they can deduce the differences there. But there's been an increase in the population of prison and probation. For one, I would say that this is a large strain on the public purse. If you think of how much and how many, well, both money but resources are spent and required to process a crime, from solving it to charging to sentencing to then remanding and then imprisonment, there's a slew of people involved in the civil sector here which are now working either overtime or having to be involved in several other cases that they normally wouldn't, and therefore requiring more resources. So there's more employment in these sectors. Then you have issues with translators, because most of these criminals don't speak Swedish and their English is obviously still rather paltry. So there's a lot of different fiscal requirements, you could say, but also human resource requirements that are needed to serve a ever-increasing crime and prison. Then I think it's quite popular and common in at least academia here to laud the Swedish and Nordic version of rehabilitation in prison versus punishment in prison. There's this idea, I think, that you have better and less recidivism, which is your instances of returning to jail or recommitting offences after having certain amounts of rehab, which we can probably attribute to the type of person who goes to prison and why. If you're a severely disadvantaged and then disenfranchised person who has had a rough family life, and you've grown up in what would be a ghetto or something, then there can be some considerations that your influences and role models have been less than elite, which is one of those, can you think about what you've done in a way that starts building what we would call empathy, then obviously applying that to future victims and saying, actually, you know what, I won't do these crimes again, and therefore I'll try to right my life. I think everyone comes with generally a knowledge of, well, generally in the West we have a moral compass, and its application varies. People, particularly from Western Europe, know if they are committing crimes or doing something wrong. Even those God's forsaken, unrepentant mastermind criminals still know that there's a violation being involved against the law here, so the juridical punishment is apropos to that, commensurate. But in that, we cannot apply those same rules to, I would say, the rest of the world, because their belief and their reaction to what is considered crime is just not the same. Speak to any policeman or judge or a person involved, civil servant involved in the very low level of the customer-facing experience to criminals from the third world, and you'll get the impression that most of them don't consider what they have done to be wrong, and if it is wrong, it would be a light malfeasance rather than something very severe. Hence why you have a large amount of repeat offenders. In Sweden particularly, you have cases of children, young men under 18 being assigned or having an assignation towards assassination. So in Sweden, you're not giving jail time if you're under 18 for certain crimes like murder. You're given probation and or youth counselling or something like that, whereby you are back out in the street maybe after 2 years of juvenile detention. So the dereliction of the law here in relation to third worlders is rather large. So your recidivism rates in Sweden, and you can see that here, are massive. So men within 4 years are 44% likely to recommit a crime and or a different crime, in which case they are back into the system. So the inability for Swedes to deport these criminals in any meaningful allotments is indicative of why these problems will persist, and the appetite to fix what would be a very logical system of you commit a crime, you are deported, is not stomachable for some reason amongst both the populace in general, but also policymakers. It appeals only to what is labelled extreme, but I would consider these fairly soft positions. I would think this is kind of the bare minimum, and this is how Asia functions. So typically most East Asian countries, the successful ones, but also the you might also call third world countries, have very strict policies around foreigners committing crimes, and that there's a delineation that if you're a criminal then you will be deported. If you're not a criminal and you're found particularly for drug crimes, you can actually be killed. So there's the capital punishment still extant in most of those countries when it comes to drug crimes. And what we would consider barbarous about the death penalty nowadays is beyond me. I think it's a fairly warranted punishment for several crimes, and there's a very loose argument to say that the victims of misattributed crimes will not be able to get their comeuppance or their redemption, but the significance of being in jail for 40 years and then getting redemption and living the last 5 years of your life with a bit of money but literally no other social context for existence is fairly meaningless. It would require some very strong evidence that it was such a common occurrence for it to not be a useful law. What we can also see as a reignition of third worldism in Sweden is here this is in Swedish, it says med användning av skjutvapen, but it's basically the way to say the usage of guns, of shooting weapons, and that the murder rates have increased with guns to the degree that you would think a country like Sweden, who probably rejoices and definitely lords itself over a country like America in terms of gun crime, is experiencing a rather ironic reversal of the trend of declining versus ascending gun murder rates. Sweden also has some strange laws around explosives, and so grenades are quite popular amongst the criminal classes in Sweden, in which case you are potentially able to see a huge surge from basically when the Balkans, the Slobodan Milosevic was deposed, but the Bosnian War, or civil wars, when they had a lot of immigrants come from those countries, the Balkan countries, into as refugees come into countries like Sweden, and then they obviously more or less imported a criminal class. That criminal class was rather ingenious in that they also not stole necessarily, but trafficked weapons out of those war zones, particularly grenades and types of handguns, and then have proceeded to use those against enemies in the criminal class. So Sweden still maintains a relatively high level of safety if you're not in a gang which is, I guess, a redeeming factor to this, in that if you're in a criminal class, you are probably very, very likely to experience crime of almost all of these natures, other than maybe rape and sex. But these ones in particular, I think if you are in the criminal class, more so than a lot of other countries, liable to experience what would be threats of death or actual assault and death. It is interesting, and I will get to the points of why I focus primarily on crime with Sweden, is because economically the country is actually managing fairly well because of the way that they've constructed a parallel society. So the Scandinavian countries in general have rather strong identities, in that if you are Swedish or Danish or Norwegian, that means a very specific thing. So brown people and Asians in general don't integrate well because it's impossible, and that it takes usually a second generation Western European immigrant to have integrated. So if you have two Germans having a child in Sweden, they'll integrate, whereas the German parents will still likely be considered foreign to a large degree, even though there's a very large cross-cultural similarity between Sweden and Germany. So there is strong dimensions around the belief that Sweden and Swedish identity is there. So you have strong parallel societies, for good or for worse. What that means, though, is that if you don't rotate in circles that are either and this is where we can actually call it an upper and a lower class, is that you're either Swedish or not Swedish, in that you can still have white people in this non-Swedish class interacting almost exclusively with the immigrants or sons of immigrants and daughters of immigrants. And this is particularly prevalent in a city like Malmo. So going in and having a look, we can see that the report, and this is actually 5 years old now, so 7 years old. So we can see that 46% don't have a migration background here in Malmo. So the third largest Swedish city has what I would probably say is now more likely 40% Swedish, as opposed to 60% foreign. And they don't allow you to collect better data than that when it comes to second or third generation, because of the way that it is typically difficult to classify what would be if you had an Iraqi father and a Somalian mother, then you would not necessarily be considered in one or the other categories. So, and if you've been to Malmo, then you will know, and this reflects some neighborhoods to a very extreme degree, that 80-90% of the populace in those areas will be more or less immigrant or descendant of immigrants, and that Swedish or English as languages are just not heard or spoken as much. And if it is, it's not a Swedish that you'll probably understand, because of the way it's kind of a reflection of, and this is also one of those ethnologist observations, but you'll typically find poorer criminal and underclasses representing what is the edgy version of culture. You have this with the African Americans producing what is edge culture in America, and the immigrants basically all through Europe producing their own version of that same gimmick, in terms of speaking differently, acting differently in a more like hard, aggressive, chauvinistic way. So in general, you'll find if you go to Malmo that there are really lovely parts of Malmo where it looks like it's just still Sweden, and then vast other swathes of that metropolitan area are just covered with immigrants. For better or for worse, this is obviously up to your own perspective. Maybe you consider that vibrant and diverse, and you like that effect. So the idea, though, is that I think, for the summation on this, that Malmo represents what I would consider the case or test study for what will be Europe 2050, which is to say that the idea that rural areas are affected by immigration is nonsensical. We know that 90% or more of third world immigrants will gravitate towards urban areas. There's a large intake of Muslims, so mosques, etc., are fairly good proxies for the different locations and suburb allocations of what is typically third worlders from the MENAT countries, in which case we just basically see a linear growth in the number of mosques, and in general of every other, you would say, bad social side effects of immigration. The median salary is lower, crime is higher, social and communal feeling of togetherness is lower. There's just a range of outcomes that correlate strongly with this. And like I said, it's completely your opinion if you think that these are good results and encourageable, or that they should be discouraged. But it is just to say that the Swedish appetite to reject this method of decline is not there. So you'll have aggressive Swedish politicians come out and say strong, very politically correct terms around reducing immigration or banning certain symbolic, like the French do, burqas or public prayer, mosque calls, all those things. But in general, you're just trying to mask problems rather than remove problems. It's trying to stop the spread of cancer, as aggressive as it is, or like slow down the spread, I should say, of cancer, rather than stopping the spread and or removing the cancer, if you like the analogy. Obviously, it's a good cancer if you like these effects, and a bad cancer if you're opposed. But in general, as I say, Malmo is the city to look at and admire as this case study progresses. And we can do a recap video in 5 years and I can see how the progress has gone, but obviously it's one of those things where decline happens in this unfantastical stepwise fashion of over a certain 150 years. The city is more or less evacuated because white flight more or less is the modus operandi of native populations from these areas, and you'll just find Malmo turns into what is more or less something like Istanbul or Cairo or something like that, where most of the civilians are brown and Muslim and have no attachment to the soil and the necessary Malmo from 1,000 years ago, like we would assume from a European city. But yes, as I say, look forward to it, and let's see